Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this week's video, we are going to make the lead sound from the Fred Again Overmono Little Yachty track Stayinit on the Novation Peak, and it sounds like this. So let's get into it. So in one of my other videos, one of the comments was, by Radic Pilch. I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong. And he said that it's all well and good just to show the numbers and how to get to the sound, but it would be better to show how I got to the sound. So I thought, let's break this down. This is a relatively easy sound, but we can go through the steps that I would go through to then get to the finished sound. So I thought this would be kind of double dip, little sound design, little teaching thing. And yeah, let's get into it. So the first thing is just having a good understanding of your tools. For this one, I'm using Novation Peak. And as you see, if you've seen any of my other videos, I do a ton of stuff on this. Full disclosure, I do work for them, but I did get the synth before I worked for them, but I got it from them from doing sound design. So I did a bunch of patches, they gave me the synth. Awesome. But yeah, I now work for them, but I still really like the synth, and it has a bunch of modulation options, and I understand it back to front, so it's a really good synth. The cool thing about it these days is there are so many, not just hardware synths, but soft synth, like Serum. Serum can do pretty much everything. So if you start to learn one synth inside out, that is really going to help you when you're doing sound design and you're trying to understand how to use and make sounds and whatnot. And the next point before we get stuck into the sound design is active listening, like really taking some time listening to the track over and over, or listening to the sound over and over, and kind of making some notes. Does the LFO modulate anything? Is the pitch changing? Is the filter doing something weird? Or is the filter opening and closing over time? It's endless. You can sit down and listen to a track, make these notes, and then when you're starting to do the sound design, you can look back at the notes and kind of go, oh yeah, I remember it does this over the course of the track. One thing that we didn't do, I didn't do for this track, for this sound, is it starts to get like an arpeggiated effect, and I honestly think that that's just from the MIDI notes or just cutting audio. So that's why I didn't sort of go too deep in adding an arp and stuff like that. I tried it out, but it wasn't getting the same effect, so that kind of led me down the path to thinking that it's either just adding more MIDI notes in, or it's just cutting the audio after the fact and getting that desired effect. So the first thing I'm thinking about when it comes to sound design is the sound mono, poly, and other layers to the sound. This sound that we're making today is pretty easy. We can hear that it's a lead sound and there isn't really anything else going on in terms of layering or it being a poly. It's just a straight mono lead. So for this, we're going to go over to the voicing. We're going to come across and we're going to select mono. And we go back to the patch. So the next thing we're going to think about, and it kind of lays itself out on the synth, is the oscillator type and the characteristics of the sound. Now this can be all the way from it's really easy to understand what it's going on, all the way through to what the hell. With most styles of music, especially in electronic and stuff like that, the sounds tend to just gravitate to those basic shapes. So your saw, your square, sine wave, and variations of that. When it comes to sort of more bass heavy music like dubstep, drum and bass, and things like that, you could be scratching your head for days because the artist has used something super weird as the oscillator shape, where in Serum you can just drag a waveform in. So you could be kind of searching for a long time to find that out, but it just comes with time and just understanding all the tools and whatnot. So for the sound that we're making today, I've listened to it and I kind of break it down into three parts. The sound doesn't have a lot of harmonics associated with it, and it doesn't have that sort of bite associated with a sawtooth. So that kind of rules that out. So the next thing I go to is listening to see if the sound is a little bit more muted or dull. So because we can really hear the presence of the sound, that kind of rules out the triangle and the sine wave. So that leaves us with a saw or a slight variation, a square or a slight variation of the square. So for this, we got one oscillator. We can turn down the other two, and then we'll come across and we'll change the oscillator shape to a square wave. So now this is what we've got. So you can hear it's kind of getting into the ballpark already. Obviously, this is a relatively basic sound, so we don't have too much to worry about there. The next thing I'm thinking about is if there is a legato or portamento between the notes, and we can hear that it does slide between the notes. So for this, I would go back to the voicing, and I would change this to mono legato. And we go back to the patch, and then obviously for the glide we want to turn that on, and I've got that set like midway there. So obviously this has to do with the notes overlapping and stuff like that, but this is what we have now. And you can hear the sliding there, and we're like 70% of the way there because the sound doesn't have very much in the way of LFOs modulating anything or the filter. So let's move on to the next step, which is the amp envelope. So for this, I would be thinking about a few things. Obviously the amp envelope is kind of like the volume of the synth. So this is where you could start to think about, is it a plucky sound? Does the sound sustain over the whole time the note's being held? Does it have a long release? Does it have a slow attack? These are all things that you kind of think about, and it's not really a case of needing to make notes or anything like that. You can listen to it and then kind of start to dial in the amp envelope. So for this, we can hear that the sound comes on immediately. So we'll have the attack relatively low. And as you've seen in my other videos, I'll just have that attack just up just a little bit so I don't get any clicks or anything like that. Decay, we're going to keep that around the mid-range. And let's play the sound as we go. So if I bring all these down again, we start again. Hear that little click. Let's move up the attack just to 2 there. We'll move the decay up to, and you can hear it's a really plucky sound now. Obviously we want that, we don't want any drop in that volume, so we're going to go sustain all the way to full, and then I want a little bit of a tail there. You can hear in the actual track there's not too much of a tail, so let's So I think it's pretty much in the ballpark there. Again, just some things to think about when you're listening to the actual sound is the attack rate, how slow or how fast that attack's coming on. The decay, if you want it to be more of a plucky sound, and then the sustain, do you want that note to be held over time? And then obviously the release is how fast you want that release to stop. Do you want it to tail into the next sound? So the next thing we're going to look at is the filter. Now this sound, from what I could hear, it doesn't have too much filtering, or if any filtering going on. It's just that lead going straight through. But some of the things that I would consider when looking at the filter is it a low pass, band pass, or high pass filter? What's the slope of that filter? If you change the slope here, so if I bring this down and turn this on, a 24 is going to be letting less sound out, and then the 12, you can hear it lets a bit more of the sound out. So the slope on it isn't so sharp, it's a little bit lower, and it's going to allow for more of that sound to travel. Obviously we have the low pass on at the moment. If we go to the band pass, you can hear it's focusing that wherever I bring the frequency knob to, and then the high pass, as it says. This one, we're just going to keep it at low pass and just open that sucker all the way. Some other bits and pieces to do with the filtering. Obviously, you're going to look at the envelope and the mod envelope over here, which is this mod envelope will control this filter by this much. So we can just do an example real quick. So let's pull this down. We're at mod envelope 1, and we'll just increase this all the way to full. So now we have a plucky sound, but if I open this up, it's gonna start to shift over to this amp envelope, and we're gonna have more sound going on. And if we bring that down, back to a plucky sort of sound. So the things to consider when using a filter, obviously you can have it changing over time with the mod envelope and the envelope depth. Some other things to look at is the resonance, if you're going to have more of a bite to the sound, or you kind of get that more spacey sound. So you can hear that sort of spacey resonance sort of sound. So these are all things to think about when you're listening to the sound, and if you can start to hear those characteristics, you can make a note, and then when it comes to the filtering, you can apply those changes or start to kind of tweak it and get it in the ballpark, and then keep moving it until you get there. So the next thing we're going to look at is modulation. So some things to consider when looking at modulation is what is being modulated. Is the pitch being modulated? Is the volume or amplitude being modulated? Is it a smooth modulation like you would get from something like an LFO? What's the rate of the LFO? And if we cruise over to the modulation matrix, you can see, if we go, keep it as direct, these are all of the things that can modulate. So we can have the mod wheel, velocity, we can have LFOs, we can have the mod envelopes, we can have these animates that are available on the peak, we can have CV, other LFOs, we can have the bend, we can have noise. There is so many just in this synth, and then obviously other synths can have even more. So when you're thinking about modulation, most times, I know when I've looked at most sounds, it will be pretty basic. It will be like an LFO or mod envelope or something like that. But just be aware, you can send the noise to the filter to kind of get a cool sort of lo-fi filtering effect. So just keep that in mind. But for this sound, you can hear that it has some pitch modulation. We have the sound either pitching up to the destination note or pitching down to the destination note. For this, we're not going to worry too much about the sound, both variations of that. I'll show you how to do both, but we're not going to program any changes in. We're just going to do one and sort of stick to it. So for this, we're going to go back to direct. We're going to go to destination, and we're going to go to oscillator 1 pitch. And then we're eventually going to use this mod envelope. So if I play a note, and I'm just bringing up a tuner so it's easier for me to get it to the required note. So we got that, we're playing an F now. So if I start to change this depth here, you can hear that change there. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down. We're going to go to -30, and that gives us an F. So it's an F to F. We're getting 1 octave of change. But there's nothing modulating that. We don't have anything going on. So let's go back to direct. And then we want mod 2 here, so we're going to use this envelope to adjust the pitch. So we're going to scroll through, LFO 2, amp envelope, mod envelope 1, mod envelope 2. And you're going to want to make sure that you select mod envelope 2 here. So I'll move this back up to 0, and I'll play the MIDI clip, and I'll adjust the modulation depth. We're setting this mod envelope to the pitch of oscillator 1, and you'll be able to hear that slowly being introduced, and you can hear the change that it's making. So you can hear it there. We've got that going, and it's kind of getting more and more into the ballpark. Obviously, this isn't perfect to the original sound, but all these little steps will kind of get us closer and closer, and then you can kind of tweak bits and pieces to get you even closer again. So the final thing that I look at once I've looked at the oscillator type, the filtering, the envelopes, the modulation, and everything like that is the effects. Generally, I won't use built-in effects on the synth just because if I use a reverb, I want to use the same reverb send for everything to kind of give it that cohesive feel. But for this, we're going to use the built-in ones on the actual synth. Now, when it comes to effects, when it's reverb, delay, even chorus, and distortion, it's pretty easy to understand and hear what's going on. Choruses can be a little bit harder if it's just a small amount, but especially reverb, delay, and distortion, it's kind of a little bit easier to hear those effects. When it comes to some other bits and pieces, it can be a little bit harder, but once you kind of understand a little bit more, if you take Serum for example, if you understand all those effects and the sound that they're reproducing, you can start to use those tools to kind of get you closer. The artist might have not used an expander or something like that, but you can use those within your tools to kind of get you to the sound, because at the end of the day, you're just trying to recreate a sound. It doesn't matter if you're not matching their steps. It's the end sound and the end result that really matters. So for this, I'm going to start with a chorus because I want the sound to be a little bit wider and just have a bit more sort of width to it overall. So let's pull the level down to 0. If I go all the way to full, you can hear it's a little bit too spaced out. So let's go to 50% there. I like 2, and then you can hear the rate, it's a bit crazy there. Bring that down to about 20. The next thing we're going to use is a delay, and the delays can be really good because it can add its own rhythm within the track, but it can also help fill it out a little bit more. So we got this down to 0. I don't have it synced, but obviously you can sync it if you want to have those sort of little polyrhythms within the track on. But let's start with the level at 0. So you can hear there, I didn't even get to 9 or 10 on the level, and it was already way too much. So let's pull that down. I got the feedback set to 50. The level is set to 3. It's just a little bit in there. And then the time, I had that set to about 38. So that's about it for the effects. I didn't have any distortion or overdrive because the sound from the original track sounded pretty smooth. So again, with everything playing together, so that's about it for this week. Hopefully you've enjoyed the tutorial and you've got to see a little bit more in depth on how I recreate a sound, and then hopefully you can take these steps for your own productions, and if you do like a sound you can kind of use that to recreate it yourself. And if you do like these sort of style videos where I go a little bit more in depth rather than just following the numbers and recreating the sound, please let me know. Hopefully this has inspired you to create something today. Until next time, see you later.